Hey class, welcome to Chapter 4, Section 2, which looks at colonial education. Education was very important in the colonial days. Kids started in grammar school. Grammar school would be like our elementary schools. The children would learn to read and write, and some of the older children, like 4th through 6th graders, even learned things like Greek and Latin. Kids learn things that we learn: math, literature, but also things like philosophy. Grammar school was about 7 difficult years. At the end of those 7 years, you were typically in the 8th grade. Most students did not continue any further in their education. There was no high school. If you had performed really well in those younger grades, you might have gone on to college in your teens, but college was pretty rare. One of the main resources used in schools was called a hornbook. A hornbook was a printed sheet of paper posted on a board that looked like a paddle. On that board, you would have alphabets, key proverbs, verses, things to learn that were really important. And so much of the early schooling was based on biblical truth. The kids learned to read oftentimes in the Bible. You can see here on this slide the one-room schoolhouse in the bottom right. All the grades together in one place, and of course the paddle book here, the horn book, here in the middle. After a while, states began to make laws that held parents accountable for their students' education. One of these first laws was passed in 1642 by the Massachusetts General Court. This is a law that required parents to teach their children. Here's what it said exactly: to read and understand the principles of religion and the capital laws of the country. So parents had to teach their kids about biblical truth and about government, how the government worked. If parents didn't teach their kids, they could actually be fined by somebody, fined by the government. Some parents felt ill-equipped to teach their kids, so they might hire a widow or a single woman to educate their children. And these were called dame schools, where a single woman would teach the kids out of her home, as pictured in the bottom right. A few years later, another law got passed, and this was the old Deluder Satan Act, passed also by Massachusetts. They thought of Satan as being the deluder, one who could delude your faith, who would delude you from what you knew to be true. And this law said that a town of 50 families or more had to have a grammar school. And the purpose was to train up the young people so they wouldn't be deluded by negative influences like Satan. A lot of the middle colonies also had schools, and they were mainly associated with churches. The Quakers in Pennsylvania established a church. In the New Netherlands, New York, the Dutch Reformed established a church. But education was by far most important in the New England colonies. Schools were really limited and sparse in the southern colonies especially. The southern colonies did not really value education. They valued their students, their children, working on the farms and helping out around the house. But for some of those kids who had excelled really well, they might go on to college. Very, very few would. The very first college in America is Harvard. At the time, Harvard College, now of course Harvard University, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston, and it was founded in 1636 by the Puritans. The Puritans wanted a place to train young men for the ministry, to train them as ministers to the glory of God. And it was named after a young pastor named John Harvard. John Harvard died of tuberculosis and left his estate to the college. So the college is now named after him. A couple other colleges in the New England area were Yale and Dartmouth colleges. A couple schools that were created because the Enlightenment, a very worldly viewpoint, came along and kind of began to dilute Harvard. These are two new schools that were created, Yale and Dartmouth, to train ministers and missionaries. So Harvard, 1636, the first college in America in New England. The southern colonies took a long time to create a college. When they did, it was the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, and it was founded in 1693. This was many wealthy Southerners would send their sons here or even send their sons to Europe before this time in order to get them an education. William and Mary, also a school created to train ministers and especially to help them evangelize to the Native Americans. At 13, 14, when these people had finished grammar school, some of them went to college, but most of them would join into this apprenticeship system. And in the apprentice system, young men would go and work with a master in some kind of a trade, whether it was a carpenter, a blacksmith, a shoemaker, or a baker, whatever it might be, they would work for them. And they would usually spend about 7 years learning this trade, learning this skill, until the master said, you have the skill down and you can go out and own your own shop. These apprentices were really a part of the master's family. You'd live with them, train with them. You were expected to be moral and serve the master faithfully in return for the opportunity to learn this skill. So at 21 then, you'd have the skill, you could go off and have your own shop, and down the road, even have your own apprentices under you. So education, very important, more important in the North than in the South. Colleges, the fact that there's a college there 40 years earlier than the South, kind of shows that. And in education, they're training them up to be ministers, to know God's word, and so that young people would not be deluded by worldly teachings.